gotten that tease of spring, and I'm just like, come on, just a little bit longer. I think I mentioned it so many times. Like I'm a spring and summer and even a bit of a
Yeah.
fall person. I hate winter.
Yep. Same here.
I hate winter. Once we re-roll the clocks back, I have a countdown going of when we spring them back forward, because in the middle of like December and January, it'll be dark here by 4:30,
Yeah.
and that's
Yeah.
just it's depressing.
Yeah. So two things. I used to be I love all four seasons to I just want it 72 degrees all the time now person. So I've made that transition. And number two is I was hearing noises in the background and hovering over the mute button. I'm wondering, Jim, if you've got your Stream Deck set up so you can just mute on your Stream Deck.
I don't yet, but that is a good idea. I'm gonna have to program that.
One more thing to automate.
It is. Well, I mean, I've got a whole panel here for Zoom settings. So like when I'm on Zoom, I don't have to find my mouse. I've got a little button right here. But then I've also got a panel with all of like the various folders I use in Dropbox. So instead of like opening up a Finder window and going through the path, I've got a little button. It opens up the Finder window right in that particular folder.
Nice.
So, I mean, it is. It's like I'm continuing to tweak it. So I've got all of those things. But no, I haven't added. So I've added in a keystroke for Timemuller. So, I mean, we've talked about all the time we don't do timesheets, but I do use Timemuller just so I have an idea of where I'm spending my time.
Yeah.
So this way I can understand, like, if I'm spending too much on one thing or whatnot, I configured a button with the keystroke. So I don't even have to open the app. I could just hit the button and the window pops up. What are you working on? Ending the previous task and whatnot. So yeah, I wonder what the mute.
Oh man, my Timemuller would be so funny. Like I've tried doing that before and I need to. It would be good for me to see where I'm spending time and stuff. But I flit so much from task to task, and especially when I'm working in launch and you hit the build button and you have to wait a few minutes for it to probably your 30 seconds, however long it is. Then inevitably during that 30 seconds, I'll be like, oh, let's go see who's asking questions on Slack or what's going on Twitter or whatever. And so it would be like 2 minutes of work and then 3 minutes of no work. And yeah, no, I'm glad to be done with the timesheet days for sure.
Yeah. And again, it's just for me to kind of see like where am I spending my time. And,
oh no, yeah, I definitely see the value in it.
But again, time saving. Just hitting a button and it automatically enters it. And I've also configured it with a few of the Mac OS shortcuts.
Nice.
So certain common things, like I've got the basement lights configured to it. So like right now, for lighting purposes, I have the basement lights off, but I have a button that'll do this. Turn them on,
fancy.
Dim them, turn them off, turn them back on again. So this way, because I normally control through the Echo. Now I don't even have to say anything, just push a button.
So modern and fancy.
Yeah. Makes you feel cool.
It does.
Sitting at the control panel.
Yeah. But speaking of cool things, that gives me my entry into our topic for today. I want to continue our theme around digital analytics, implementation, and just overall data collection architecture, and talk about the hip, cool new thing that all the cool agencies and vendors are talking about: server-side tracking. And it's being pitched as the next great leap forward in analytics and marketing data collection. And yes, there's some very real problems it's trying to solve, and there's definitely great value to it. But it feels like well, it doesn't feel like it. It is. It's being positioned as the cure-all for all of the ills an organization has with data collection for web activity. So that's what I want to talk about this week is how does server side tie into everything we've been talking about the last couple of weeks? What is it realistically? Where is it at? And honestly,
that's the question.
Is it overhyped?
It's so funny because the topics were chosen, like this has been on my calendar for a few weeks now, knowing that this would be on this topic. And cracks me up though, because 2 days ago I got into a huge, long Twitter discussion on this exact same topic with Lucas Oldenburg had a really good blog post about this. But it still it resulted in a back and forth of, well, does it really solve that problem? Or, yeah.
So
I have
let's,
strong feelings.
yeah. And
right?
so I was gonna say, like, I can go get a blanket and we can get comfy and just let Jen talk here for an hour, because she definitely has the expertise. But I'm gonna start it off with a question. I think, Jim, you kind of queued it up, with like, and I'll show my unknowledgeable view of where I understand things. Like, can we start with what it is? And I'm going to start with a situation that we had with a vendor, Facebook, and the client, in which Facebook, through one of their partnerships, was pushing very heavily for the company, the client, to go server side. It was going to solve all of these problems with ad
and they're doing that
attribution.
universally.
Same here. Yeah, I'm hearing it too.
Facebook is pushing really hard for their conversions API.
And so I was invited onto a call with Facebook, with the company. And one of the questions that, and I kind of read through some of the requirements that Facebook was sending over as far as what needed to be implemented. And I said, I don't know if I'm reading this right or if this is a typo or whatnot, but it says that we have to put this client-side code on there as well that sets this cookie, that the server-side code is somehow going to... Like, well, yeah, I mean, for now, you still need a client-side cookie for this to work. So, like, what is it? And what is the state of it? And what's the future promise of what it's supposed to be?
Is this where I
yeah, this is queuing you up.
So, server-side... Well, let's say server-side tag management. And the way that it's usually referred to these days, where we're actually talking about a client-side batch of data that's collected and then sent server-side, where you then divvy it out and send it along. So both Google and Adobe do this kind of similarly with the Adobe Web SDK and obviously Google GTM server-side, where you still send in a batch of data through JavaScript using data elements, cookies, whatever, into whoever is managing your tag, so Adobe, Google. And then on the back end, you're able to say through APIs where to send the data along to. So with Adobe's tool, if you send it to Adobe, it automatically divvies that data up to the right Adobe tools. So if I send page name and I have it in the right XDM place where Adobe knows to find it, I send that along, and Adobe sends that to Target and analytics and all of that. And then let's say Facebook also is interested in that. That's where I would pay for event forwarding and go in and set it up to say, take the information I sent in, that includes page name, and format it into Facebook's API request and send it along to them. So there's still a huge client-side element to it. It's just now we have one big batch of client-side data rather than 10 different batches. Right now, it's all orchestrated by your TMS, but you're still sending the data to 10 different places.
So can we dive into that just a little bit? And I don't want you to lose your train of thought, but does that make it less of a risk or more of a risk that we now, in this scenario, have a fewer amount of companies that are collecting data client side? Does that make it more or less risky that someone's going to come down and say, well, we don't even like those people collecting data, and that cuts off everything? Or is it less risky because you have a few key players and they're going to try to develop a meaningful, mutually agreed on way of doing this?
I think the latter, especially when because it does limit transparency a lot. So it'd be much harder for somebody to come in and say, I don't like what you're doing with my data. So long as I'm sending it, to my own server, and GTM server side, like it's your own server even and everything. Like there's far less chances of folks looking at it and being like, third party, don't trust. So I think it's the latter, but it is introducing one big point of failure. And you still have all the little points of failure too, of are you setting up things for the server to server transactions correctly and stuff. So that doesn't go away. Yeah.
On that, who has the onus for making that happen? And again, I'm going to show my lack of understanding of the space, but as a kind of a comparison, I'll talk about maybe the integrations we see with a Google Tag Manager and an Adobe Launch, where there's an open marketplace for building connectors between platforms. And I'm going to contrast that with, say, 𝐴𝐡𝐞𝐫𝐞 that has their own, we're going to own building all the connectors between platforms. How do you see that working out in server side? Who ultimately is responsible for making, because those backend connections are critical, obviously, to making this work. It needs to be not only designed and built, but then maintained between all these different touch points.
Well, and Adobe, since the days of DTM, has tried to not own a lot of the extensions and connections and things like that. Partially just because it's a maintenance and liability nightmare and all of that. But with server side, so let's say that I'm implementing a tool or a vendor that doesn't have a connection. Right now, that means I would just go into custom code, and right now, client side, I would just go into custom code and plop the JavaScript in there, and it's fine that an extension doesn't exist. And that's also true for Adobe server side or event forwarding. I'm going to call it server side. Sorry, Adobe. I'm not sticking with your branding. That they do have kind of an empty template for, well, what's your API endpoint, and what things do you want to attach to the body of stuff you're sending over that way. And to be honest, right now, Adobe Event Forwarding, well, maybe they've gotten a few more, but they only had like Adobe, Facebook, and Google, maybe. Very few extensions in that catalog so far. And some of it is, some of these vendors don't even have ways of sending data in through an API. So right now the onus would be on me, unless it's Facebook, which, because they've been so loud and pushy about their conversions API, Adobe has a conversions API and extension and all of that. But everything else, it would be on me, the implementer, to go and read the documentation from the vendor on how their API works, and then figure out how to implement that within the event forwarding interface.
Seems like a massive failure point. But
yeah, but I also, I don't blame Adobe. What are they going to do?
I mean,
that would be
impossible, and that's my argument for 𝐴𝐡𝐞𝐫𝐞 owning the integrations. It's like, it's impossible for 𝐴𝐡𝐞𝐫𝐞 to own all the integrations that are needed to make this happen. And even if they do, they don't have the sheer volume of people and expertise to keep them updated. So yes, on one hand, I see it like either it doesn't exist or something exists and it's owned by the end platform to make it work. But then again, it does put a tremendous amount of pressure and onus on the implementer to, I guess, be the orchestrator. And I think you've seen this, Jen, that you're kind of looked at not just as the technologist to figure out how to get data from A to B, but oftentimes I've seen you have to be the translator between all these people to make sure we're talking the same language. It really increases the scope of what you're doing to make this work server side. But I guess, is the promise that you set it up once and maybe done, but what happens if how do you stay up to date on the API? So let's take a very simple example. And I say this as one of our clients rolled out 28 pixels this morning. Let's take a simple example where a company's using 5 different pixel platforms, like a Facebook, a Google, maybe there's an Instagram, a Pinterest. And those are not within the platform kind of native from the vendor. The implementer has to figure out how to build that connection. Does that now put the onus also on you to monitor it? Like, how do you keep up? Like, what if Pinterest changed their API? How do you know? Do you get a heads up? Like, it seems scary.
Yeah, and to a degree, we already have a lot of that currently with just the JavaScript world of things. Though I do feel like the JavaScript tends to be pretty backwards compatible, that so long as you don't update the library that you're referencing, using the deprecated code is fine, kind of thing. API wise, that could be a little trickier. And it just hasn't been around long enough to know how much that's going to be a problem, I don't think, as far as the maintenance. But I definitely foresee that there's going to be a lot of set it and forget it, because that's that's what we do in JavaScript. We shouldn't be, but we do. So I will say, though, that having it be more of an open marketplace like Adobe's doing on the JavaScript side of tag management, yes, it's had negatives. Like there aren't extensions for things I want there to be extensions for some of the time, or the extensions aren't flexible in the ways that I want them to be. So I end up just using JavaScript anyways. But I do like that third parties can build extensions, and it doesn't happen as often as it should. I say that as we are a third party who at times has built extensions. But take the 𝐸_tag extension that was in launch that Adobe/Google, I don't know how much it was a collaboration, but somebody made a kind of branded, this is the official 𝐸_tag extension. But then Acronym made an extension as well that better suit the needs and the gaps that they saw. Everybody ended up using theirs and recommending it. And I don't think the first official one, like you don't even see that anymore. So I do like
that. Free market.
Yeah, that it makes room for folks to come in, see where there are gaps, and create stuff. It's just, now we have unofficial parties in there trying to create stuff, without necessarily the back end knowledge of what changes need to happen.
Do you feel like Adobe's made progress in embracing the developer community down that path as they've gone to server side? Because it seems like a pendulum. Back in like 2006-07, they fully, and maybe that was back at the Omniture time, I think it was under Chris Wareham, really embraced the developer community. They made these sandboxes available, and developers love to develop stuff. And one of the knocks on Adobe is there's this whole developer community out there that doesn't have access to the Adobe products, that wants to build products for it, and they simply can't. Has that started to shift?
I definitely do think it has. That they've, especially in the last year or so, they've really built up a developer community and made it easier to do things through APIs and document everything. They do still have the problem of the sandbox data, that it is still hard to get a area to play around in if you don't already have the right connections. But once you do have that data, they've made it so much easier and are working with developers pretty closely across the board on just trying to make it as easy as possible to build stuff.
Yeah. So we've talked about Google and Adobe, to a lesser extent, Telium. Who do you see the major players falling out as that will be kind of the key entry points client side to collect data?
I think those are the three.
Yeah.
I mean, 𝐖𝐡𝐞 technically still exists and technically has a server-side option, but it's kind of it's using a server to approximate JavaScript. So it's not necessarily API to API. It's you send your big batch of data to 𝐖𝐡𝐞's server, and then 𝐖𝐡𝐞's server replicates the JavaScript pixels, kind of. That might be outdated knowledge or just not correct knowledge, but that was my understanding the last time I saw. But yeah, the Telium, Adobe, and Google are the main ones. And I hate to say it, but really I think it's Google. Telium's been out there for a while, and they've been doing server side, this type of thing. They've been a pioneer in it. They've done it for a long time.
Does that mean that identity management and attribution is also going to be set at that Google Adobe level, or how does that work?
So that's where I have all the strong opinions.
Well, let's go.
So here's the problem: is we're still collecting the data client side, and whatever data we send in still has to have an identifier for the user. And right now, the way that you have client-side identifiers for users is cookies. Like, nothing about that has changed just because server-side has entered the equation. And yeah, as far as I can see, for the foreseeable future, the identity management side of things is still being handled client-side. So when server-side comes up as a kind of a response to the cookie apocalypse, or the getting around ITP or GDPR or any of that stuff, like, it's just it's not part of the equation. Even it doesn't make a difference, because we still have to know on the client side who the user is as they go from page to page. I will say, however, in my discussion with Lucas and 𝐲𝐶, how it ended up coming in too, on Twitter the other day on this topic, where I was making this very point of, anything that you do to improve your identity management for server side, you can also do client side. It's the exact same thing. 𝐲𝐶 does have a template within Google Tag Manager server side that allows you to set cookies through a server through, I think it's Google Cloud, so that will help with ITP. Now, it's not built into the tool, and it's not really kind of wrapped into this is what server side is. To me, it was kind of a creative, nice workaround, sort of like, I'm glad it exists. It's cool. It's usable. It's effective. But overall, identity management is not yet folded into what server-side tag management does.
Do you see that something that gets pushed more towards, and I don't want to use the word client side, but the brand owner side rather than the data collection side? I mean, it's completely different, but we've gone through this. Speaking of cookies, we've gone through this thing where it was set by a third party, then it was managed, like this first party was managed by the third party and set, and then we got to this point where it's like, well, you set these C names and maybe you set it on your side. I'm wondering if we get to a similar place with identity management where there's some kind of a trust handshake where they say, hey, you set all this stuff up on your server, so we kind of get around all of these complications, and then we go from there.
I think ultimately it's going to come down to everybody setting their own IDs, at least as far as first party analytics goes. Obviously things that are trying to do retargeting across sites, it's going to get more complicated. But and both Google and Adobe have really upped their game as far as allowing companies to use their own IDs. Adobe just barely had their cross-device, no, not cross-device. They don't want it to be device. Device management ID, whatever the new ID thing is. And then with GA4, you also can send in your own user ID, and it's almost like GA4 is pushing for that rather than use the IDs that Google puts on there. So that gets you around a lot of the ITP limitations that Apple makes it so that if you set a cookie by JavaScript or through a server, but a C-named server that your cookie only lasts 7 days, if instead, we just have our own identifier for users and we tell Adobe to use that instead, that gets us around it.
Does that mean that I now have to invest in more software, because most companies are not qualified to set identifiers for anonymous traffic? So do I now have to go buy something? Do I have to go hire some experts to build identity management for me?
I don't think so. I think a lot of the time it might be that your developers already have like session IDs and stuff like that that in CMS systems. Like a lot of that already exists. The problem historically has been tying it all together when it changes. That right now it's, if we have an ID for a user when they sign in, but it's different than when they're not signed in, they're going to look like two different users. Whereas in the future, or with the newer stuff, it can merge those profiles together and end up having 10 different IDs that all kind of melded together into one user. And that was the missing piece for a really long time that stopped us from using our own IDs.
And theoretically, that should be able to help with a lot of the privacy conversations we're having, in that, right? In that one ID flows to everybody.
Yes, but the problem still is, especially if we're talking about GDPR or the CCPA or any of the ones coming out in the US, they really just care about, well, we talked about this in the podcast a few weeks ago. They really only care that you have a unique persistent identifier for the user. And whether or not that's in a cookie or it's third party or any of that, it's if you have a unique persistent identifier, if you have a way of knowing the user is the same person who was on the previous page, then odds are you need their consent. And it's just as subject as a third party cookie,
Got it.
Unfortunately.
Yeah.
But where it will be changing consent management, in that now, for potentially even if whether the user consents or not, we might be sending that huge old batch of data to the server. And then based off of their consent decisions, either it stops there or it goes on to certain things or it goes on to everything. So I do see consent management moving more server side rather than client side, which is a whole big thing. Like the transparency thing becomes a big problem. Yeah, I don't know. We'll see how that goes. Right now with Adobe, that's not as much an option. It's kind of an all or nothing. They consented, yay or nay. You can't really divvy it up and say they consented to this and not that. I honestly don't know with GTM server side how consent management's done.
And I don't want this to get into a big consent management discussion necessarily, but is the consent portion mostly driven by sending data to a third party, or do the same rules apply to me as the owner of the property that you're interacting? Meaning, can I just collect whatever data Jenn generates on my site because it's my site? It's that the privacy rules really are more on what can I do with that data sending it to someone else, or and the reason I ask that is that I wonder where the perceived server sits, if that makes a difference. In that, if it's my server, then I can just collect whatever data, and then the decision is send it somewhere else. But if it's Adobe's or Google's server, can I even send that big chunk of data to them?
In general, in theory, it wouldn't matter, other than GDPR is picky about the actual physical locations. So not even who owns it, but where it physically sits and whether or not, say, the US authorities could come in and look at it if they wanted to. So in that sense, it does matter. But aside from that, it still comes down to the what you're tracking and not the who's doing stuff with it or the how they are getting it. So if you have a unique persistent identifier and you're using it, you want to use it for retargeting, it doesn't matter which server that is happening on, whether it's only through JavaScript or it's now GDPR is complicated about data processors and the rules they have to follow and where they have to be, but in general, it still really is about the what you're doing and not the where or the who.
So what? I guess a couple questions. One, future looking. What does the future look like? Like what are you hearing? What are you seeing as far as what the future looks like of a server side world?
I think right now, the real advantage to moving to server side is, I think more on the page performance is the biggest boost, I think. It also forces kind of some governance and things like that, but there aren't a lot of advantages to it thus far. Even if we are taking advantage of these new things I was talking about where you can set your own user ID, well, you can also do that and send your data client side. So that's kind of detached. So I see folks moving server side. At this point, I almost feel like it's premature, unless they really are pushing for the page performance. If they just want to send one thing and not have a bazillion pixels on their page, then that's reasonable, and that's a good route to go. But aside from that, I don't see a ton of advantages to it. In the future, when consent management, there are more options on the server side of, okay, we got this huge batch of data, they didn't consent, we can block it all right there. And that's fine, versus I want to be able to divvy it up and control it all, not client side. But we're not there yet. Again, I need to look at it. I don't know enough about GTM server side and consent management. Oh, same with Tealium. I don't know how they handle consent management because all I've ever done with it is client side so far. But,
so if I'm an implementer and I'm at one of these big companies that is often understaffed and I'm responsible for analytics on 5 different websites, is server side going to be less time, more efficient for me to manage and maintain, the same or more?
At this particular moment, I would say probably more, because so much of it is new.
Yeah.
And in many cases, there's a lot of transition that needs to happen. If you're starting from square one, like you have a brand new website that's never had analytics on it, then maybe starting with server side in mind would be a lower level of effort. But at the moment, I don't know that it would get you too many gains because of the amount of time that you would then have to spend figuring out, well, for this vendor, how does their API work?
Yeah.
And for that vendor, how does their API work? Or does this vendor even have an API? And if not, oh, we still have at least one client-side tag on our site. So now we still have to manage a client-side tag management and a server-side tag management.
Yeah. Okay. That's good to know. I think I had a really good follow-up question on it. Escaped my mind.
Can I jump in then?
Yeah, I will come back to me. Go ahead.
Yeah. So, I mean, if I'm hearing everything correctly, it sounds like there's really only one tangible or realistic gain going server side, which is page performance. If that's the case, why are a lot of vendors, we gave Facebook as an example earlier, really pushing for, the server side, these API connections? Why are they doing that? Could there be an ulterior motive? Like that's honestly, as I'm hearing you talking, that's one of the ways my mind starts to go is, are they trying to get you stuck into something?
That's a good question. As far as like what's Facebook getting out of pushing everyone to the conversions API other than an area with less transparency? I honestly don't know, and would love to get more information on that, because from my perspective, it's largely been, what are the advantages to me as an implementer of using server side?
Yeah.
But what's the advantages to them? Don't know. I just don't trust them, and I think it's fishy.
And that's exactly where I was going with this, because like, you listed off earlier, who are the top folks involved in this, and they're all the ones that are building these walled gardens. Mm-hmm. So if you jump in this too early, do you risk getting stuck into an ecosystem? And that is one of my concerns right now, seeing this massive push for something that the only real benefit, it doesn't solve necessarily for cookies. It doesn't solve a couple other things. The only thing is page performance. Are you getting stuck in someone's ecosystem?
I do think that part of the advantage might not even exist yet, because they still say, oh yeah, well, you still have to have a Facebook ID, set the or a Facebook cookie or whatever. But I think it is setting us up for that world where Facebook disowns user ID management and leaves that to the user. That's my guess, is part of a big reason folks are going more and more this way, because Facebook's read the writing on the wall that third-party cookies and their ability to use their own identifier across the board is just, it's not going to be a thing in the future. So I suspect that's part of it. But like I keep saying, that could be true of a JavaScript implementation as well. If they really wanted to push for folks using their own user IDs, then you don't need an API to ask for that.
Yeah.
But server side, yeah, I don't know. I need to better understand if it's not just a new way, and therefore making everyone feel like it's different enough that it gets around those rules.
My neighbor's a baker, and so it's not good for the stomach line. I see them bringing over pastries.
Nice. And there's a doorbell.
Yeah. So the untrusting Jason thinks that there's a couple of things happening here. Number one, and I'm only basing this off of my interactions with Facebook, is I don't know if it's easier or if it's just because it's a new methodology, it's easier to slip some things in. But in every instance where I've talked to Facebook, they've asked for all the data. And they said, just send us all the data and then we'll have that available for your retargeting. And so the untrusting Jason says, ooh, this is just a way to kind of slip in a request to get more data that we hadn't asked for before. They may not want to have given us before. And that kind of makes my skin crawl a little bit. The other part of it is, and I think that there are real world problems today. We mentioned page performance, but I think that this probably builds the foundation for future use cases that may not be relevant today. But part of me also thinks that a lot of these companies are publicly traded companies and they have to grow. If they don't grow, they're contracting. And so when you've saturated the market with one way of doing it and we need to create a new product line, then, well, let's invent a new way to do it because we have to have more sales to continue to grow the company. And so
Sure.
It's a crappy way to think about things, but I think it does happen a lot, especially in our industry where I get so frustrated seeing companies just bare bones minimum usage of these platforms, and yet we're having, and I put this kind of flippant post on social media the other day, it's like we're talking about lake houses and lake shores and ocean mines and I'm like, you guys can't even tell me if someone went from page A to page B. Like, what are we talking about here?
Yeah.
But part of it is, there's tons of pressure from vendors to do it the new most exciting way, and if you're not doing it and keeping up with the Joneses, then we're just not good enough. So that's the untrusting Jason, that we're just inventing new ways to do the same thing. But I want to put an asterisk on it as saying I do see future use cases where it could be incredibly valuable.
No. I do think that I did leave out one part of it where Facebook particularly, where Apple's both ITP and their ATT, their app tracking transparency stuff, that just kind of cut off Facebook at the knees sort of thing. I do think it made them scramble to improve the quality of whatever data they do get, not the quantity, sure, like Jason was saying, but ad blockers and connectivity issues and JavaScript errors, like all of that does lessen quite a bit. Of course, they are putting all their eggs in the basket of the server side batch of data that you've got gets through correctly and has the right data in it, but it does at least improve the quality of the data and get around some of the browser issues that might exist.
So you reminded me of the question I forgot.
Oh, okay.
So you mentioned it's really easy to see the errors and stuff client side. What does that mean going to server side? Does it lessen our visibility into the process and now it's only Jenn that can debug it? Because right now I can go onto any website and at least get a sense of what's going out. I can look at the data packets. That goes away in a server side world. So what does that mean for maintaining, debugging, looking? Like, what does that mean to an observe point that makes their product that examines all these things client side?
Yeah, no kidding on the observe point front. I would love to know kind of how what their thoughts are and solutions are for it. But yes, as far as the debugging goes, it does. It completely removes transparency. I know Adobe's worked really, really hard on at least giving me, the implementer, transparency, both through their debugger and Griffin, or whatever its new name is. But even that's really tricky. Like, and there's a bit of a learning curve for knowing how to understand and troubleshoot. Just like there was for JavaScript, but I've had that knowledge for a long time. So yeah, it does change the debugging quite a bit, and it can be really hard to tell where something failed, if something fails. But at least on the Adobe front, I know that they're working on transparency for the batch of data that's being sent. Sorry, almost a sneeze. I chased it away. And then also on the side of at least giving you an audit log of, okay, we sent a batch of data to Facebook and we know that it didn't get received correctly. So which in some ways is better than what we've got now. Like, I don't really get an audit log of these are all of the attempts you made to send data through a pixel, and how many of them failed. So that aspect for server side is good, but I still, knowing why it failed or why it never got to my server to begin with or whatever is going to be trickier.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how much how deep Observe Point or any of these other kind of scanning solutions have gotten. I mean, they've been around forever. And there are some companies that it's really deeply integrated into their process, but for most, it isn't. It's not because it's not incredibly useful. I think there's just lack of ownership and governance, but
and time. I think that's the big thing. Is
the big thing.
It takes an investment to get much out of it.
Yeah, and so it will be really interesting to see how they start to position if server side starts to pick up steam. And I'm sure they're not alone. I think they're the easy one to think about, but I'm guessing there are other solutions out there that are kind of sitting on top of the fact that the transparency of all of these marketing data initiatives are right there in the browser. If that goes away, what does that do to that ecosystem? I'm sure it's going to create new opportunities. It's just, what is that going to look like? And especially if it's owned, because now, like, I can go and build a Chrome extension to examine your tags, right? And no one can stop me from doing that as long as I'm following the rules. But what happens if it goes server side? Like, I can't just attach to that, right? I have to work through whoever owns that server side handshake. So it really kind of starts to close off that playground a little bit, it seems like.
Yep, absolutely.
Interesting times ahead for sure. What are the timelines you thinking? Like, or I guess, what is your sense of, how many companies are seriously looking at doing this today? And then how do you see that changing over the next 2 to 3 years? And that's a long timeline in tech, I understand.
Yeah. I don't know. I see a lot of folks starting the conversations and then getting a little ways into it and then being like, yeah, never mind, not yet. Like as soon as you find out that, oh, by the way, half of your marketing vendors don't even have APIs to use, and you're still going to be stuck doing a lot of client side stuff. A few of the limitations that were keeping me at least from telling people, yeah, go onto the web SDK, which is kind of prerequisite for going server side. A lot of those limitations are improving rather quickly. Problems in the XDM schema building tool. Now we have the ability to either map our data layer. Let's say I have a digital data, old school W3C data layer. I could either go into launch and use a tool within client side launch to say, okay, my XDM object for page name needs to live here. Let's map that to digital data.page.pageinfo.pagename. Or I can go on the back end now with the XDM mapper and just send my digital data object and then tell it where it needs to go into XDM. So stuff like that, that's making it a lot easier for current implementations to move on to it. And then just making the interface easier to use and all of that. But to me, the big limitation is still just what's the selling point? Why, if it's not helping me with my biggest concerns around consent and user IDs and cookies and all of that, it's a whole lot of effort for a bit of page performance gain.
Yeah. So how would you package that up? Or I guess, what advice would you have for people that are probably getting hit up now to buy software or services to address this, to not fall victim to the FUD factor of, you have to do this or everything's going to burn down? What would be the advice that you would give them?
I think it's honestly like, make a list of your main problem points that you are trying to solve for, and very specifically try to see if these new solutions solve for those problems. So, if item number 1 is our cookies don't last longer than 7 days, then don't accept a vague server-side answer of, yeah, but server-side makes it so that you don't have to, have client-side stuff as much. Like you have to have a very specific, like, here is how this is being solved. Otherwise, it's very easy to just fall victim to the server side will solve it. You'll figure it out and see when you get there.
Yeah. Outside, so again, very limited exposure, but it feels like Adobe and Google have been pretty neutral in their pushing of server side. At least from my observation, and I'm comparing that to Telium, which has seemed ultra aggressive in pushing server side. Is that a fair observation, or how are you kind of seeing how these larger companies are positioning it?
I think for a while Telium was pushing it so strongly because they were the only one out there who could do it well.
Okay.
And knowing that that was their strength, they wanted to hype up why that was important.
Yeah.
And the fact that they could do it well, and from my understanding, kind of work around some of the API limitations of vendors and things like that is still a strong point. I really do need to know more about its current state for Tilium now. as far as Adobe and Google's push for it, Adobe is certainly pushing for folks to move to the web SDK. And I think part of that is it makes it easier for folks to then say, we already have this great setup for customer journey analytics and the Adobe Experience platform. Or, on the GA side of things, that if I'm already in a GA4 world, which it's definitely pushing for now, and a lot of the server side stuff goes hand in hand with that. I think, I do think they're pushing for it mostly because it makes it easier for them to upsell their own data technologies of saying, hey, you know what, just send all of your data to our server. And then, oh, by the way, for this added fee, we can make it easier to use that data just right there on your server, and you don't have to send it on to anyone else. That's what I see largely. And I mean, if you go to Summit, so much of what they talk about is journey analytics, customer journey analytics, and AEP, because that's where the cool stuff is. Workspace is cool, but some of those Summit sneaks, if they got that in analytics workspace, like, that'd be glorious. But now it's journey analytics stuff.
So that was going to be my last question, but I'm going to ask one more. So if I am that implementer, web analytics director, manager, and I'm sitting on top of a fairly stable, decently documented implementation today, how much time and budget do I need to be thinking about in order to make a migration to server side?
It really comes down to what you mean by well documented and stable and all of that. Because on the Adobe side, at least, where you have to map everything out to XDM. You have to know what it is that you currently have to do that mapping. Like if your data layer isn't well documented and you don't know how it all works currently, it's going to be really hard to know how to translate that into an XDM layer. If you don't already know what all third-party tags you have on your site and which of them are still current and which of them could probably go away and who owns what and when they expire and all of that, then it's going to be really hard to know what needs to move server side. If you don't know where all your Facebook pixels are, then how are you going to, convert those into Facebook conversion?
And I think those are important questions you're asking, because a lot of this is part of implementation, is vetting this out and figuring it out. And unfortunately, when we say implementation, a lot of people think, well, like going in and actually typing stuff and deploying stuff. And like, that's only part of it. And that's a small part of it a lot of times. So
the easiest part of my job.
I mean, that's the hard part is
let me write JavaScript, please. Don't make me audit your third-party tags.
Yeah, I mean, the hard part is really analyzing all of these kind of questions that you're starting to bring up. And so I'm guessing, but is it weeks? Is it months? Is it half a year? I know that's hard to pin down, but I know that, again, these people are going to be hit up with it. And one of my fears is that they're going to be sold, it's super easy. And then it sets them up for failure. Even if these are monumental shifts that have huge future potential, I think it's important to be transparent so you can be realistic and say, look, this is going to be hard. You're going to have to invest a lot of time, but it's going to be worth it, rather than saying, it's a couple weeks and you'll be up and running.
Fortunately, I haven't heard a lot of that marketing of it'll be easy. Certainly not on the Adobe Tag Management side. Like they know that there is a big learning curve with the move to XDM and all of that. They're trying to make it easier and give templates and use cases and training and all of that. But most of the things that you could do now to prepare yourself for server side are things you should be doing anyways for your client side implementation.
Great point.
So it's hard to say timeline wise, because hey, if you haven't done it already for your client side implementation, if you don't have it well documented, if you don't know where all your pixels are, if you aren't using a data layer, or you're using a data layer everywhere except this one place where we had to do something a little bit different because it was a weird use case, all of that stuff's going to make it a lot harder to move to XDM. Or to move to GTM server side as well. Like you have to know what you currently have to work with. So
Jim, make a note. That's a clip. Pull that last 3 minutes out. That was gold.
Should be doing it anyway.
It's spring break, so you get the kids running around the house in the background.
That's all right.
No worries. So I mean, this conversation has flown by, and it's been awesome. And as we were kind of coming to an end there, I kind of want to kind of end it with a laugh a bit. So, have either of you seen the YouTube series Pitch Meeting?
I've heard of it.
Oh, it's hysterical. I'll send
I'm
you a couple of
Googling.
the funny ones. It's I think it's a series done by, I think it's Screen Rant, and it's the guy plays both characters, and the one character is a writer, the other one's a movie executive, and basically he takes real movies and it's like what this pitch meeting probably sounded like.
It's
So it
got a
takes
real. It's almost like honest trailers kind of
it's
feel to
right
it.
along the lines of honest trailers, but they always hit on like the major plot hole of the movie. And there's a tagline that goes with it, because as the guy's going through the movie, the executive goes, "Well, you did this earlier. How are we going to solve for this now?" And he's like, "Oh, it's not a problem. Barely an inconvenience." Like that line always comes in, and that's all I could think about. There's the last couple of minutes as you were both talking it's, you know, with this it's barely a problem. Barely an inconvenience.
It's super
Yeah.
simple. It's the
Yeah.
magic. It's the
It
magic
is.
tag.
And I
Yeah.
mean, we've seen this before. I mean, I feel like I've been on this rodeo before through the years,
Yeah.
like, the concept of a magic tag.
I don't know, because I'm beginning to feel kind of the opposite, that for once our industry is reveling in the complexity of it. That I
Mm-hmm.
mean, the move from Universal Analytics to GA4 is a really good example of this. That they are almost assuming that folks have evolved and that they are interested in deeper data science and that they're going to be taking the data into BigQuery. And like, I feel like that's on the Adobe side as well. Like we were saying, it's almost an upsell, because if you've done that, then you can move into AEP and do cooler, bigger things with your data that require data science. And uh, they can't sell this as this is simpler and easier. So
Yeah.
instead, they have to pitch this is more modern and opens up a lot of capabilities and all of that. So, and I'm sure there will be salespeople out there that do the like, no, it's barely an inconvenience. But I'm not getting a lot of that feel from either vendor of this is the simple new way. So easy a marketer can do it.
Is that because you're talking to the product managers that are probably
Yeah,
more transparent than the
that's a good
salespeople, that
point.
maybe the product's not mature enough for the sales guys to go out there and kind of give their BS spiel?
Yeah, that is a good point. That I'm not talking to the salespeople probably a bit deliberately. But I do know it would be a very hard sell to say,
Yeah.
this will simplify things.
Yeah.
It'll improve things, maybe, yes, but it's not going to be easier, especially for like an entry level, someone without a lot of experience already doing this sort of stuff. So
Yeah. All right.
yeah.
Good stuff.
Yeah, great stuff. So really enjoyed this one. So we'll go ahead and wrap up here and talk to everybody later.
See ya.
All right, thank you.
Bye bye.